Thank you, Mr Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, fellow Australians. The right to vote, to freely choose who shall govern us and how we shall be governed, is the legacy that all Australians owe to all other Australians that have gone before them. Our security and the nation's rests on the right of our citizens. The validity of the government and the laws that we live by are derived from the people for the people. A good debate has its victim. I don't mind being a victim, provided the truth will prevail over injustice. We must always keep an open mind when we look at these electoral issues. An open mind allows us to continue to think and grow as individuals. An open mind allows us to be receptive to ideas and to come to the right conclusion, considering all, not just some. And finally, an open mind allows us to understand other people's points of view, even if we don't agree with them. Having an open mind allows us to avoid conflict. It allows us to engender respect and unite different points of view and to achieve a positive result. Parliament was meant to be the supreme forum for the real debate to establish the nation's agenda. I've been critical of the Australian electoral laws and procedures. Today I will tell you why and how I experienced them in my election in the 2013 federal election as a candidate for the seat of Fairfax. And my conclusion is surely they need to be changed. You may not agree with me, but that's okay. We live in a diverse society where the differences of our nations are one of our main strengths. Not many Australians are members of political parties. I was surprised to find that many of the temporary AEC officers employed for the election were in fact card-carrying members of our major political parties. I think it would be appropriate in a fair election process to exclude from temporary officers of AEC current members of a registered political party. And there's a good reason for it, as it removes any conflict and supports the independence of our democracy, as well as having an electoral process that oozes with integrity and impartiality. Australia must have an election process that has the appearance of incorruptibility. Approximately 2 weeks before the date of any election, the Australian Election Office informs in writing the AEC officer at each polling booth in the nation of which two candidates in each federal division is to have the preferences distributed to them on the close of voting on the election day. It's provided to them in a sealed envelope to be opened at 6 p.m. AEC officers at each polling booth in every division are directed in writing, regardless of the result on the ballot paper, regardless of the vote of Australians, they are required as employees of the AEC to follow the AEC's direction. In my case, I was among the first top 2 candidates in Fairfax, and the AEC polling captain started to distribute my votes and my preferences to members of the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, contrary to where I finished on the ballot paper. It was only my personal intervention at the behest of my scrutineer and a threat to immediately injunct the AEC in the High Court on the night that stopped the election, which stopped them distributing me out of the election. Why does the AEC do such undemocratic practices? What role does the AEC have giving anyone a direction on who they'll distribute preferences to in writing? Surely that undermines our democracy. Surely that gives the impression that they're seeking to rig an election outcome even when they know it's wrong, even when the ballot says something else. Is this just the entrenchment of the two-party system? This practice, brought in under the Hawke's legislation, setting up the AEC, destroys independence and the very idea of an impartial election. This practice has to stop. So does the practice where the AEC predicts the election results and the two-party referred results. And that often happens before voting stops voting in Western Australia, or publish the results prior to the polls closing, as I said, in Western Australia. How can the AEC be independent as it should be when it has a role in the outcome of the election, on knowing whether its predictions are right or wrong, or knowing whether the preferences have been distributed in accordance with its instruction? When it instructs its officers to act contrary to what's on the ballot paper, it creates a very dangerous precedent for our democracy. As the so-called losing of the 5 ballot boxes in Western Australia confirms, the whole election process in Australia is not reliable and is untrustworthy. And it's very uncomfortable for you as Australians to believe that, but it's very important that we have an open debate and an open discussion about these factual matters so that we don't take our democracy for granted and we realise that we too have to be ever vigilant to maintain it. The accountability of the AEC to a parliamentary committee has shown to be less than acceptable. Let's consider the election process itself. Firstly, there are too many dead people on the roll. Well, one could argue there are too many dead people in Parliament. The AEC does not strike someone off the roll when they die. The AEC does not monitor that process. The AEC does not monitor who votes for them at elections, which has been known to happen. They should be required to make changes to the roll by searching the deaths between elections and removing dead people from the rolls. And of course, this sort of abuse can happen because no ID is required to vote in Australia. If you want to buy a pharmaceutical, if you want to board a plane, they require your photographic ID. They don't require ID to exercise your franchise as a citizen of this country to elect people to Parliament. Isn't that strange? Why don't they do it? We must demand that they do in future. If no ID is shown, how do we know who votes? How do we know that they are Australian citizens? How do we know that they are the people they say they are on the roll? And when a person votes at one of the polling booths, in some of our federal divisions we have up to 80 different polling booths, you'll have experienced it yourself, they get a ruler and cross your name off a pad, leaving your name as not having voted in the 79 other polling booths. So if someone wants to vote twice, they just have to go to another polling booth. And that's happened, and it's been documented that that's happened. Why don't we have a network or an electronic system that when you're marked off in one polling booth, it automatically marks you off right across the electorate? It doesn't have to be on the internet. It can just be on a network set up between each federal division. If all booths were linked by a computer, they could ensure that a person was recorded as having voted in one booth. They could be simultaneously marked off the roll in all the other booths. It would stop people using other people's names to vote more than once or voting more than once themselves. Electors, as happened with my father-in-law who's here today, with a foreign-sounding name, are used to vote multiple times in multiple booths, returning multiple votes in the election. And the elector knows nothing about it. He was given a notice saying he'd voted 5 times in the last federal election, when in actual fact he'd only voted once, because people had saw him on the roll as a new Australian, who looked to be a new Australian by his vote, by his name, and someone had voted for him on 4 other occasions. And he was picked up on that by the AEC and asked why he did it. And he didn't do it at all, of course. Right? The elector is given a ballot paper. Upon the AEC issuing the ballot paper, it's initialled up the top. You'll have all experienced that, someone handing in the ballot paper, initialing it and giving it to you. This is done to give the impression that the AEC is concerned about the integrity of the election and the integrity of the ballot paper. Nothing could be further from the truth. In my election to the Australian Parliament, when it was clear to my scrutineers that ballots had been tampered with and ballot boxes interfered with, which I'll go on in a minute, when my scrutineers requested access to the initials or those initialing the ballots to verify the ballots being counted matched those that the AEC denied such request and wouldn't give them any access to who had actually initialled the ballots. Over 10,000 ballots were challenged by my scrutineers and were eventually included in the count for my opponent. On each occasion, the AEC refused to verify the ballots by reference to the person initiating the ballots in the future. Then, when the ballot papers are issued to you, the elector is directed to go to a booth to find a pencil attached to a piece of string, presumably so it won't be stolen. Why use a pencil? Well, the answer is simple. A mark made with a pen can't be rubbed out, but a pencil can. And when you looked at some of the votes that were counted later in my election, there were a number of votes that didn't have a 1, that had been rubbed out or raised, or the person had just got to put them there. In Fairfax, there were 5 different colours and 5 different types of ballot papers. As well as that, Under the AEC Act, you don't even have to use a ballot paper. If you like, and if the AEC approves it, you can handwrite out by pen and pencil the names of who you want to vote for and reproduce the ballot paper in pen, number it and put it in the ballot paper. In my election, ballot papers of this nature were found. They were challenged by my scrutineers as not being properly issued, not being proper ballots, and they were approved by the AEC for my opponent. And there is no way of knowing where a ballot has been cast, from which booth it came. And it's very easy to move votes to other booths when it's needed. For ballots to be colour-coded for each booth and to be printed in sufficient quantities and accounted for and audited and reconciled at the end of election should be a fundamental requirement of any election in any democratic country. The numbering and counting of ballots, whether you number the ballots or whether you colour-code them, would eliminate one of the real issues I faced as being the elected member for Fairfax. At the Coolum Beach polling booth in the 2013 election, there were approximately, on the AEC's website, 750 more votes cast in the House of Representatives than there were votes cast in the Senate. So there was around 750 more votes cast in the House of Representatives, and this was put up on the AEC website. And the AEC quickly removed them after we pointed out to them the discrepancy. They then advised us that they'd found the 750 Senate votes up at Budrum booth, which was some 15 kilometres away, and that they hadn't gone on the website yet, so would we just agree to change the labels on where the votes were cast, right? I didn't accommodate them in that. Instead, we went to the federal court and we had it preserved, that the evidence had to be preserved, that there were 750 ballots cast in the House of Representatives at Coolum Beach without Senate ballot papers. And that's a matter of great concern. The reason I, in the end, got elected to Fairfax was because nobody wanted to appeal this case because they were worried about the evidence being presented in the court. Right? It seems, though, to me, the answer is quite obvious. 750 people in a 4,000 electorate booth voted in the House of Representatives, holding their Senate papers. They all simultaneously hopped in their cars, drove 20 kilometres and voted for the Senate. How stupid I am that I couldn't accept that. How unreasonable I am, according to the AEC. Anyway, what happened, those 750 votes, coincidentally, were all given to my opponent, none to me. A remarkable fate where people were thinking the same. They thought they'd vote in the House of Representatives, go up and vote for the Senate, and they'd all vote for my opponent. Fantastic, right? And that's what the evidence showed, and that's what actually happened. What was disappointing was that the AEC again refused my scrutineer's request to check the initials on the ballots. And when we examined the ballots, we could say 350 of them had no initials. They were just cast. If ballots from each polling booth had their own colour, this anomaly would not happen, or it would be exposed. To get a proper understanding of voting in Australia, we need to start with the pre-polling. Pre-polling starts up to 14 days prior to the election date, and votes are not counted until after the election is known. And at the last election, I think there were over 20% more pre-polling votes counted. Pre-polling votes can change the result made at an election, and this is a matter of great concern. To have a valid voting process, all pre-poll votes need to be counted, if not announced, on the day they are cast, with scrutineers checking the votes on that day. At the present time, pre-polling votes are just put in a box, left in a rented room and left overnight in rented premises, unguarded, where the owner of the building or others with a key can enter and have the opportunity of interfering with ballot boxes. And that just shouldn't happen. One of the important things about the Constitution, it talks about an election. And the idea of an election is that it takes place on one day, so it can be properly scrutinised under the one political circumstances where Australians can make a judgment. That's not what happened in 2013. It's not what happened in Australia for over 30 years. Leaving them unguarded at the night and lack of security is of great concern, whether or not the AEC is doing it or someone else, right? Or removing them, as was done in Western Australia. We saw in the first count in Western Australia that there were 1,370 ballots cast, about 2 metres long, that they were there, and obviously Uri Geller was a scrutineer because because they disappeared, you know, and then they had an investigation. Now, it's not too difficult to know that if something's there and then it's not there, then it's gone. And then they had to get the Australian Federal Police to come and say, to make that conclusion that it was gone. But they didn't know where it went, and they didn't know who took it, right? But it's gone, right? Having been there and now having been gone means that somebody took it, I would put. And they either did that because we were about to be awarded the third senator in Western Australia and the balance of power in this country, and someone didn't like it. They didn't know we were talking to the motorists in Victoria, God bless them. Or who knows why they did it. You know, if you look at the 5 booths that are gone and you look at the results for those 5 booths and you add them to the partial recount, Palmer United wins another senator in Western Australia. You know, it's too convenient to know that those votes were gone and to not think that something sinister hasn't been involved. In my booth, we saw a grave difference between the pre-poll booths and what was being experienced on election day when we had scrutineers counting the votes straight after the election, right? For example, at the Coolum Beach polling booth, even though there were 750 votes in there that weren't for me, I got 51.9% of the vote in the pre-poll. At Coolum Beach on the voting day, I got 61.06% of the vote. Right? At Maroochydore polling booth, I got 44.18% of the pre-poll, but on election day I got 58.61% of the vote. These are areas which are all the same. You know, these are areas with the same demographic people. It doesn't make sense that the pre-poll vote should vary by up to 20%, and it does raise a question, why did that happen? At the Nambour polling booth, for example, I got 52% of the vote in pre-polling. I got 64% of the vote on the election day. And you can go right through the electorate and see how there's a great variance. None of them in my favour. All pre-polling votes should be counted and scrutinised on the day that the votes are cast. Otherwise, the integrity of the pre-poll needs to be questioned, as does their security. In Indy, they found 1,000 votes to elect Cathy to the Australian Parliament. This shows a lack of security. The votes should never have been lost in the first place. In Western Australia, as you know, the AEC lost or stole 5 ballot boxes, disappearing again with 2 metre long ballot papers, 1,370 of them. Or did Uri Geller do it? Or was someone actually hiding behind the curtain? Or did someone come back at night and had a key and removed them? We'll never know. Right? Was it because, as I said, the election of D.O. Wang as a senator for us would have made a difference to the balance of power in the country? The AEC security, or lack of it, as well as an organisation, has been exposed in the Kelty report and the handling of the Western Australian election. Why hasn't the Electorate Commissioner or the Deputy Commissioner of the AEC accepted responsibility and resigned, as any minister would? No care and no responsibility. Once Australian ballots were locked up under lock and key, with 2 people holding the keys and 2 different locks in a sturdy metal box. Today they're kept in a cardboard box with a rubber band around them. They can be tampered with very easily. In the case of pre-polls and postal votes, no ID is required and they are not counted till after the result of the election on the day is known, and the rest of the execution is known to the people who are allegedly counting the pre-poll votes or telling them up. They should be counted and scrutinised first when they're received, not later when they can be changed or eliminated. This would eliminate the possibility that they could be altered or adjusted once the result of the election was known. The eligibility for postal votes should be restricted to those with a genuine need to make them. They should not be seen as a convenience, and the AEC is now proposing that the postal vote should be expanded so people can vote again without ID, and these mysterious votes can arrive in the mail and no one knows what they are, and they're not received and scrutinised by anyone till after the poll under the current systems. If Australians were required to produce ID to vote, if there was no more pre-polling, as there wasn't for the first 90 years since Federation, before the AEC, took over, if the AEC checked regularly and took dead people off our electoral rolls, there would be far less abuse. If all polling booths were linked electronically and people just went in and pressed a number to who they wanted to vote for, and then much of the cost of running federal elections would be reduced, and the taxpayer would be saved the burden of approximately $40 million every 3 years, which could be money which could be better spent. It should be really simple. You should just go in, show your ID, press the number for the candidates you want and walk out. Then at 6:10 on election day, the result would be known, the distribution would be known, and the whole thing would be transparent. The Commonwealth would save, as I said, tens of millions of dollars. There would still be a need for an electronic audit program, the rights of candidates to audit, but Australia's integrity would be protected. The legacy of the Anzacs would be preserved, and Australians, wherever they live, would know that this country is fair dinkum about democracy. Thanks very much.
Authorised by James McDonald for the United Australia Party, Brisbane.